With regard to sexuality, you said that it is a good question to ask yourself. Who is in control? Well, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? You know, if you're masturbating to pornography and the consequence of that is an immediate influx of guilt, then you have to ask yourself who's in control. And do you have any advice on what to do with porn and masturbation? The less porn, the better. That's my advice. But let's make that more specific. To the degree that use of porn and masturbation is undermining your sense of yourself and providing you with a dearth of motivational reasons to get out there and engage with a real partner, then it's definitely not in your best interest, and that's what your conscience is telling you. You know, and it's the expedient at the expense of the meaningful. Obviously, right? Obviously, there isn't any more obvious manifestation of the expedient at the expense of the meaningful than pornography and masturbation. And that's hardly a heroic path. So maybe the less of it, the better. I'm aware, by the way, of the statistics showing that the introduction of pornography into a community doesn't raise but lowers rape probability. I think that's a separate discussion from this, but I just want you to know I'm not ignorant of that. If you're ashamed about your sexual behavior, then you have to ask yourself, is the shame wrong or is the sexual behavior wrong? And I'm asking you, I'm not judging your behavior, because what the hell do I know about you? And I have enough trouble with my own behavior, so, you know, this is on you. Is your shame what you should be dispensing with, or the behavior? And, you know, it might be a little of column A and a little of column B, because life is never simple. But if you don't feel ennobled by your porn-related masturbation, then perhaps that means it's of questionable utility. I certainly don't see it as a stabilizing social force. I don't see it as something people do in public and brag about. And I know that sexual behavior is private and should remain that way, but you get what I'm driving at. So, look, I think people shouldn't lie, especially to themselves. And I think repeatedly engaging in a behavior that you judge yourself to be morally reprehensible is a form of performative contradiction, which is the acting out of a lie. And I suspect you know that, or you wouldn't be asking the question. And so, you know, what should you do with pornography? Well, you know the answer to that, and so does everybody else. Everyone knows it's not good. It's not good for those who produce it. It's not good for those who participate, wittingly or unwittingly, because there's plenty of them, in its production. It's not good for its consumers, or certainly not the highest good. And what's the highest good? Sexuality incorporated within functional, intimate relationship, bound by vows of mutual celibacy. And we all know that too. That stabilizes our families. It stabilizes our societies. It stabilizes our psyches. And so anything you do that isn't in service of that goal is likely to be counterproductive. And I suspect it's your own psyche, your own soul telling you that. So if your sexual behavior isn't an expression of your highest being, it isn't serving you in the deepest sense. You're serving it. And that's what your shame indicates. Get out there and find a partner and commit to her or him. I'm a 25-year-old female. I think I'm afraid of intimacy and closeness. The thought of a man taking care of me and having to cede some of my control to create room for that scares me. I want to try and be in a romantic relationship, but I don't know how to allow it. What advice do you have? Okay, well, let's take your questions apart first of all. I think I am afraid of intimacy and closeness. Okay, fair enough. And the first thing I would tell you is that does not make you unique. And I'm not saying that in a manner that's designed to be condescending or insulting. I'm just saying that, well, that's a very common fear. You're not alone. You may think you're alone in that, but you definitely aren't. And it's also a justified fear. I mean, if you allow someone to be close to you, then you open yourself up to them and they can hurt and betray you. So of course there's reason to be afraid. So what do you do about that? Well, there's reason to be afraid of lack of intimacy and distance. You want to be alone for the rest of your life? That's a frightening thought. In all likelihood, it's not that easy to get through life on your own. You know, it's lonesome and difficult. And if you're in trouble, you don't have someone to help you out, and you don't have someone to help when they're in trouble, and you don't have anyone to share your triumphs with, and all of that. So that's not good. So you might be afraid of intimacy, but you should be at least as afraid of its lack. And so maybe those fears can balance. You know, you say, well, I'm afraid of intimacy, so I won't go there. Well, you're not afraid enough of being alone. And so you got to bring that up. It's like, yeah, well, I don't want to be alone for the rest of my life, assuming you don't. It seems like you don't, because you said, I want to try to be in a romantic relationship. So you want this. And it does look like fear is inhibiting you to some degree, because you're 25, and it sounds from the tone of your question that you haven't been in a relationship before. So it could easily be fear that's stopping you. So let's talk about trust for a second. You might say, well, why should I trust when I could get hurt? And that's a good question. You trust when you're naive because you don't know you can get hurt. And that's not ethical. That's not moral. It's not laudable. It's just naivety. Once you know you can be hurt, you trust as a courageous decision, knowing that if you trust someone, you can bring out the best in them, and knowing that if you don't, you'll never see it. So it's a calculated risk. And it's an intelligent, calculated risk designed to move you and the other person to the best. So you can tell yourself that I'm going to take a risk. I might get hurt, but I'm going to take a risk, knowing it's a risk. It's a reasonable risk. Don't be a fool, but it's a reasonable risk. And remember that you have some reason to be afraid of intimacy and closeness, but you know, you should also see both of those as positives on your side. To be intimate with someone means that you can share your thoughts with them and think things through with them, and you can share your triumphs and your disappointments and all of that. You broaden out your life, you broaden out your ability to solve problems. You increase the probability, all things considered, that you're going to remain sane, because two people who are communicating are generally saner than one person who is only thinking by themselves. So you don't want to deprive yourself of that, even though it's somewhat dangerous to be hooked up with someone. I stopped wasting time. That helped a lot. I stopped drinking. I stopped going to bars. I really didn't spend a lot of time with my friends when I had young kids in particular. I had friends and I saw them, you know, with some degree of regularity, but where I cut corners was more with social life outside my family. So I spent a lot of time with my wife, and I spent a lot of time with my kids, and I spent a lot of time on my career. And so you have to make choices. And I think those were reasonable choices. I'm not displeased with them. Don't abandon your friendships, but you can certainly look at where you're wasting time and just stop doing things that you know to be a waste of time. And I did. And so I had enough room for my marriage, and I had enough room for my kids, and I had enough room for my career, and, you know, sort of a multi-dimensional career. And it was always a challenge to me too, to see how efficient I could get. And you could also, and I've really recommended this for relatively higher income, dual income couples who are trying to pursue dual careers, kids, and marriage. You can outsource, you know, hire a cleaning lady if you can afford it. Buy restaurant food if you can afford it, etc. You know, you can outsource. You can have someone do your laundry. Then you can concentrate on your marriage and your kids. I know that, you know, is only an avenue available to people who have relatively high incomes, but people who have dual incomes have relatively high incomes. And so outsource what's unnecessary so that you can concentrate on what's necessary. I mean, I didn't do that when I was beginning my career, because when I lived in the United States, when I was in my late 20s and starting my family, we had one income. You'd think a Harvard beginning professor makes a lot of money, and I suppose that's true in some absolute sense, but relatively speaking, you know, we didn't have enough money to buy magazines. We all our money went for housing cost and the basic necessities of living. I had a car that was 20 years old. 25 years old, I think. It was old. It was a bloody thing. The doors fell apart on the person I sold it to, you know, like 6 months down the road. They knew it was a wreck at that point, but we drove that thing right into the ground. So I know that's not necessarily possible for everyone at the beginning of their career, but if you have two incomes, you can manage it. I concentrated on my marriage and making time for it. I concentrated on spending time with my kids consciously, and I concentrated on developing my career. Those were the three elements of my life. And I had some time left over for creative pursuits and for friends, but most of it was a matter of getting rid of time wastes of any sort, and I just pushed that out of my life, day after day until I wasn't wasting any time or virtually no time. And, I've asked my undergraduates frequently how much time they waste per day, and general estimates are like 6 to 8 hours of time they regard themselves as wasting. Like that's a whole career right there, right? So if you just stop wasting time, you can do a tremendous amount, especially if you also try to maximize efficiency. And I always found that incredibly motivating, a motivating game. How much can I do in the least amount of time possible? That's fun to try to do that as far as I'm concerned. I know, that's maybe undoubtedly a temperamental thing, but if you're wired that way, that's a great meta strategy. Become efficient. I always asked my graduate students when they were designing experiments, they'd come with a proposal. I'd say to them, is there any way you could do this 10 times faster? What would you have to cut? What would you have to change to do this 10 times faster? And you can learn to do that. I also learned to force the task to fit the time. There's this dictum, work expands to fill the time allowed for its completion. Work expands to fill the time allowed for its completion. Well, there's a corollary to that, which is work becomes more efficient in proportion to the restrictions of time placed upon it. So if you say, well, this could take me 2 weeks, but I'm going to do the best job I could in 1 day, you'd be amazed. You can get 90% of the way or 95% of the way, or sometimes even farther in that day. So that's another way of becoming efficient. If you only have 10 minutes to do something that should maybe take you 2 hours, maybe you can figure out how to do it in 10 minutes. You can get dreadfully efficient. So that's very much worthwhile in my estimation. If you want to do a lot of things, what else are you going to do? Rather than become efficient, if you want to do many things, you don't have much choice. But I found it extremely entertaining to try to do that. And when I was healthy, I could do a tremendous amount in a very short period of time. I'm very frustrated that that's not so much the case now, although perhaps it's coming back to some degree. If your behavior is embarrassing you, well, there's only two possibilities, isn't there? You shouldn't be so embarrassed. And I suppose the voice that says yes to all expression of human sexuality would say that your guilt and shame is merely the detrimental hangover of an oppressive patriarchy that's judgmental in its attitudes towards sexuality. Well, yeah, what would you use judgment to differentiate if it isn't sexuality? So I don't think that argument goes anywhere. You have to consult your own conscience. Like, I know the conscience can become an oppressive force on its own. That's the indwelling of the great tyrant, and Freud made much of that, a too oppressive superego. And I've certainly seen clients whose expression of healthy sexuality was inhibited by a too rigid superego. That can definitely happen. But that doesn't mean that all guilt about all forms of sexual expression constitutes a superego run amok. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that there was some relationship between the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which, according to Randy Thornhill, by the way, who's perhaps the world's top biological thinker on this particular topic, Thornhill believed that the liberalism of the 60s was a consequence, at least in part, and in large part, I should say, of the hygienic revolution of the previous 6 decades and more that enabled us to reduce the impact, at least in the West, of infectious diseases. And because we were much less prone to the transmission and receipt of infectious diseases, we could afford to be more liberal by the 1960s. So we got more sexually liberal. And what happened? AIDS. And I say that without prejudice. And what's the most effective means of facilitating the reproduction of a deadly virulent agent and its propagation through the population. Unrestrained sexual behavior. And so that would be a multitude of partners. So sexual shame is there for a reason, and it's not a trivial reason. It's not just going to go away because we may wave the magic wand and make the patriarchal oppressor vanish. And that's not going to happen either, by the way.